Hello again, everybody. So this week we're talking about a specific theory of morality. So we're really jumping in this week into what makes an action good or bad, what makes an action obligatory, morally obligatory, meaning it's required of us if we want to act morally, what makes things just merely permissible instead of obligatory. So we might be permitted to do something, but not required to do it. And then what makes it immoral for us to perform certain actions. So when are we required to refrain from acting? And utilitarianism is one theory that gives us answers to these questions. Why do we start with utilitarianism? Well, roughly, it's a pretty intuitive way of thinking. So a lot of us use like a cost-benefit analysis when we're thinking about what we should do, right? So how much benefit will I receive from acting in the following way? We weigh the cost, we weigh the benefits, we see what the total is, and we go from there. In addition, utilitarianism has been widely influential and still one of the theories philosophers talk about and argue over today. So we need to get a rough feel for this. Right? And so, although we're going to look at two specific utilitarian philosophers and see what they think about morality and utilitarianism, generally, utilitarianism is the view that we should always look to the consequences of our actions. So we look at all the different actions we could perform, we look at the consequences of all those different actions, and then we see which action produces the most utility. Utility gets defined in different ways. Some philosophers think we measure utility by measuring happiness. But then there's a further question, what makes something happy or sad, right? So what counts as happiness? And then some philosophers will say, well, it's the satisfaction of our preferences. It's the satisfaction of our desires. Some people simply say happiness is just gaining pleasure and avoiding pain. So the important thing to take away here is just to note that there are multiple variations between utilitarian theories, right? So utilitarians can take a number of different stances. They can all disagree with one another about the proper way to understand utilitarianism, but at its core, they all agree on the same thing, right? What's important when we're evaluating morality is looking to the consequences of our actions. Okay, so now we're going to look at a specific version of this theory to give you guys a feel for it. And this comes to us from Jeremy Bentham. I can get just, there we go. Jeremy Bentham was a British philosopher, and although he wasn't the first to have utilitarian thoughts, he's known as the founder of utilitarianism because he was the first to give it this sort of fundamental treatment, really spell out what he thought it meant for morality and for philosophical thinking. So, to start, Bentham gave us the principle of utility. And here he says, we approve or disapprove of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish happiness. Now, this is a little imprecise, and philosophers have sort of picked on little parts of it over time and tried to make it into a clear sort of analytic statement, right? So the rough idea is going to be, for Bentham, when he says happiness, he really means pleasure. So happiness equals pleasure. So put that back into his original principle, right? We approve or disapprove of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish pleasure. So what do we need to be doing with pleasure, though? Bentham claims that morality is merely a function of maximizing pleasure. So if we want to know what we're supposed to do, what should we do if we want to be good people, we look at all the different acts in front of us that we could perform, and then we look at the consequences of all those acts, and see which one produces the most pleasure. So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to perform the action. We're morally required to perform the action which maximizes pleasure. We'll look at a couple examples in a second so you can see how this plays out. But that's the rough idea. We always need to be maximizing pleasure, so we just look at all the different actions and see which one produces the most pleasure. Hopefully, by this point in the semester, you're already formulating some objections, right? You're already formulating some worries, some questions. Here's a major one you should be having. Okay, well, this principle of utility sounds all right, but how does he actually support it, right? How does he argue that we should accept the principle of utility? And this is an important question to ask, and Bentham doesn't really have a satisfying or completely satisfying answer. It's pretty good. But roughly, he doesn't give us a strong positive argument that the principle of utility should be accepted. He claims two things. First, he gives us a similar reason, similar to Epicurus that we looked at earlier in the semester. Remember, Epicurus said pleasure is the sole good, and Epicurus also said that, well, I can't really argue for it, it's just a fundamental thing about being human. And Bentham thinks there's something to that. There's just something fundamentally attractive about pleasure, and something that fundamentally drives us away from pain. So if this is something fundamental about human experience, it makes sense it would be a good way for thinking about morality. But he does have something else that's a little more convincing. And that's where he claims that every other theory about morality is really just reducible to the principle of utility. What do I mean here by reducible? He just thinks that every other theory of morality, at its core, is really just saying the same thing as the principle of utility. So here's an example of that. There's a theory of morality called divine command theory, and in divine command theory, the claim is that what's morally right or wrong is commanded or forbidden by God. Well, Bentham's going to say this is just equating morality with whatever pleases or displeases God. Right? So God's going to command things because it pleases him to do so or it doesn't. Our performing those actions either pleases him or it doesn't. So if all we're doing is following God's commands, then all we're really trying to do is maximize happiness again. What we're doing when we're obeying God's commands is trying to please him and bring that pleasure into the world. So if Bentham's right that we can really reduce it in this way, his claim is going to be that divine command theory is just really a weird way of saying we should try to maximize pleasure. Okay, so let's look at some examples now. So through this example, you'll get to see what's required of us, how a utilitarian would think about actions. So it's a Friday night. Right? You had a long week, you're coming home, and you're going to decide what you're going to do that night. And you have some choices in front of you. First, you could go party with your friends. Whether you drink or not, or just dance or don't like dancing, whatever it is, whatever your idea of a good party with your friends is, that's what's on the table. So, doing this type of partying with your friends is going to bring you a good deal of pleasure, obviously. The number is not super important specifically, so let's just give it a number. Let's say if you went and partied with your friends, it would bring you 100 units of pleasure. Your second option is to study for your classes. You got final exams coming up soon, you need to get some studying in. So instead of partying, you choose to study. Well, studying's painful. It's not the most fun thing in the world. Right? So we're going to say it gives you negative 10 units of pleasure. And then finally, you could watch Netflix. So instead of studying or partying, you watch Netflix. And although it's not as fun as hanging out with your friends, it's definitely more fun than studying for your classes. So we'll give it 25 units of pleasure. Now, if this is how it breaks down, then according to the utilitarian, we would be morally obligated to party because that would produce the most utility. Right? So the utilitarian would say, given your three options, you're morally obligated to party. Now notice, this is very important, right? Partying brings you 100 units of pleasure. Well, Netflix brings you pleasure too. Why couldn't you do that? Because for Bentham, you have to maximize pleasure, right? So take the two options. You could watch Netflix and bring 25 units of pleasure into the world, but you could do something better. You could party and bring 75 extra units of pleasure into the world. So it would be wrong for you to study for your classes, and it would be wrong for you to watch Netflix. The best thing you can do is party with your friends, so you're morally obligated to do so. And so at this point, sounds pretty good, right? Morality is not this sort of difficult thing that requires us to do a lot of sacrifice, right? Look, we're told we're obligated to party whenever that brings us more pleasure. Partying brings more pleasure than working and studying and all that stuff, right? So maybe this theory doesn't sound so bad. But I'm guessing many of you are feeling a little weird at this point. You're thinking something's a little fishy. I mean, sure, partying is going to give us more pleasure right now, but studying will give us more pleasure in the long run, right? So partying is going to give us a lot of instant gratification, but studying and doing well in your education can bring you more pleasure in the future. So maybe we were wrong, right? Maybe we don't need to just look at utility right now. We need to look at utility over the long haul. And that's right. Bentham agrees. We're not just looking for what's going to produce the most utility for me tonight. What we really need to do is look and see what's going to produce the most utility for me over the long term. So let's change our example around a little bit. Let's refine it and see how we can change these values to account for looking into the future. Right, so option one is still party. But we need to change the amount. It's no longer 100. Right, let's give it 25. Because even though going out and hanging out with your friends is still going to bring you a lot of pleasure, let's also imagine that that means you skipped all of your studying, and because you skipped your studying, you fail your final exams. Right? And so that brings you a lot of pain. That's not a good feeling. Right? Failure is not a good feeling. Getting a poor grade in a class isn't a good feeling. Right? So and it could affect your ability to get your degree, which could affect your ability to get your job. Right? So it could be way lower than 25. But let's just say you get the pain of failing your finals. So we're going to give partying 25. Well, now studying has to go way up, right? Because even though it sucked to miss the party and hang out with your friends, you passed your exams and you graduated. So you get that pleasure you get from achieving things, from doing a good job. Right? So studying gets bumped up. And then finally, we can say watching Netflix actually ends up in the negative now, because that would have all the same pain as partying, right? You miss studying, so you fail your final exams, but it was less pleasurable in the first place, right? So now the net total's been brought way down. And so now this seems like we actually have the right result. We're obligated to study because this brings more pleasure in the long run. So we have to look at the overall consequences of our actions and not just the immediate consequences of our actions. And that seems good. That seems to accord with morality, right? We always think morality is not something uh, that just makes the world better right now. It makes it better over the long term. So a final thought before we wrap up this video. Notice that what you're obligated to do according to utilitarianism will be sensitive to each person's context, right? So we just put some numbers in for you in those examples. But if you really would get more long-term pleasure out of partying than studying, maybe you don't care about your education or something like that, and you really like partying, well, then that's what you would be morally required to do. If you're different, if you think studying and achievement is more important than partying, so you get more pleasure out of it, well, then that's what you would be required to do, right? So it's going to be sensitive to each person. But the general rule is that we're always morally required, obligated, to perform the act that would, as a matter of fact, maximize the pleasure in the world. So that's also important. It can't just be what we feel would bring more pleasure into the world. It has to actually be the action that would bring more pleasure into the world. So we'll see some more about utilitarianism in the next few videos, but hopefully this gives you a good general feel for what a utilitarian is thinking. Thank you.